My name is Capucine Korenberg and I'm a scientist at the British Museum. I was trying to figure out the chronology of the Great Wave. There's not just one impression of the Great Wave, as many people think. There were originally thousands of them. Nobody really knows how many there were, but we know it was a very successful print. At the time, Japanese prints were very cheap and you could buy them for the same amount of money. You would buy a double helping of soba noodles. So anybody who wanted their own print of the Great Wave could buy one. Experts think that at least 8,000 prints of the Great Wave were pulled from the woodblocks and sold. And possibly prints were made until the woodblocks just started to be so worn out that they couldn't be used anymore. And prints are not numbered or dated. So if you want to know if a print comes from an early edition or from a late edition, you have to look into details at them. I spent about 50 hours just looking at Hokusai's Great Wave. This is about the same amount of time you would spend brushing your teeth over 2 years. So next time you brush your teeth, just think of me looking at the Great Wave. I'm surrounded with printouts from the Great Wave and one real Great Wave from our collection. The British Museum is actually lucky enough to have 3 prints of the Great Wave. I've decided to show you this one because it shows the most sign of woodblock wear. So it's not the most pristine one because we've got one that shows very little sign of woodblock wear, but here you can see what I'm talking about. Most woodblocks have not survived from the Edo period. They were made from a mountain cherry tree and they were just reused. So once there was nobody interested in buying a print, they would just recycle the wood. So scrape all the design away and carve a new design. So this is a modern woodblock that show how the keyblock, the original keyblock would have looked like. So you see all the ridges here, they will be the details that will print out the outlines on the print. So you can imagine the amount of time it takes to carve something like this. How an impression would be made, it would be by applying ink on the woodblock using a little bit of nori, which is rice paste. Then the paper would be applied on top of the woodblock and pressure would be applied using what's called a baron, which is a paddle made of bamboo twist and lacquered paper. You would do that with one woodblock and then you would go to the next. So it was a step-by-step process. Typically you have the key block, which was used to print the outlines. So this is just the lines, the cartouche here and the signature. And then you had other color wood blocks to print the blocks of color. So on this one, for instance, a block was used to print the dark gray here. One was used for all the light blue area there, one for the medium blue, and so on. And for each print, you had one set of wood blocks, and they would be used until customers didn't want to buy any, or until the wood block would start to deteriorate so much that they couldn't be used anymore. So why a scientist of the British Museum is telling you about art history? Well, I started working on the Great Wave when I was asked to look at its light fastness in view of the late Hokusai exhibition at the British Museum. I fell in love so much with this print that I wanted to try to find everything I could about it. So I started working on it in my spare time. And then the curator invited me to join their team working on the Hokusai print and in particular on the Great Wave. I wanted to learn how this print was made, and I started to look on YouTube. I stumbled across a woodblock printer based in Tokyo, Dave Bull, who tried to recreate his own Great Wave. And what he said about the Great Wave that we had in the museum and about the Great Waves in the Metropolitan was just fascinating to me. He said he could see small differences between the strokes, making him unsure if they'd been printed using exactly the same set of woodblocks. I was really intrigued. I checked Dave Bull's credential, we exchanged some emails. I also took my courage in both hands and I sent an email to our curator. I just wrote to him. I said, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in woodblock prints at all, but I've met someone online who is an expert and is making this claim that the 3 great waves we have in our collection may have been printed using 3 different sets of woodblocks. What do you think about it? And he replied to me, Capucine, this is not an email to send to a curator on a Friday evening. Tim told me that I almost gave him a heart attack. But then he watched the video and he said, okay, this sounds interesting. We're looking at differences between different impressions. We're following up on the work that Roger Keyes has done. He was a great friend of the museum and he spent almost 30 years of his life looking at single sheet prints of Hokusai and trying to establish the sequence of them. But he also invited other scholars to look at his results because he said, no one's perfect, people make mistakes. I'm sure I've made mistakes and I really would like people to look at my work. And Tim asked me, since you're so interested on the Great Wave, can you look at the Great Wave specifically and try to see if the sequence of states that Roger Keyes established is right or if there are maybe mistakes. And so this is what I did. So imagine the impression of the Great Wave as Hokusai had intended. So all the lines are crisp. You've got no gaps in the lines. The ink is where it should be. And we happen to be very lucky to have bought one around 2007, possibly first edition print of the Great Wave. It's got very fine details. The signature, the borders of the cartouche, of the title cartouche, are very crisp and fine. The summit of Mount Fuji is also very precise. It just looks perfect. All the blocks are well aligned because when wood blocks start to age, they start to become distorted, so you've got misalignment. The prints, some colors that are covering areas where they should not cover, but in first edition you see none of this. It looks perfect. So the first thing I did was try to locate all the surviving impression of the Great Wave, and that was a bit of a treasure hunt. So Roger had managed to locate about 50 of them, but he didn't do any research after 2007, and he didn't have access to high-resolution photographs. So he sometimes had to rely on very small black and white Polaroids. It was not an easy task. When I looked at Roger's notes, so he identified 21 states of woodblock wear. There are some things that didn't really make sense. So, for instance, he identified in state 5 and 6, he identified 2 breaks in the cartouche. So, if you looked at the key block at that time, if you were there at the time this impression were pulled from the woodblock, you would have seen gaps in the cartouche. But suddenly, in much later states of woodblock wear, these gaps in the cartouche disappear. So suddenly you've got these straight lines in the cartouche. So it doesn't make sense. So what I think happened is how the printer applied the ink on the key block, or how much pressure he applied with the baron on the paper. And so not the same amount of ink transferred from the woodblock to the paper. So this state 5 and 6 that Roger identified, I don't think they're proper states of woodblock wear. They're just differences in the printing process. And this could be due to the speed at which people had to print There are historical records that show that people could print 3,000 keyblock impressions in a day. So that's quite a lot of work. You have to go quite fast to do this amount of printing. I was really lucky to have the 3 impressions of the Great Wave coming to my lab. And I can tell you that the night before they were due to come to the lab, I had my knees shaking. I was just worried I would damage them in a way. I've looked at it under high magnification. I've looked at the fibers, and when you look at the paper, oh my God, it is so fibrous. We looked at the colorants that were used on the prints, and what we did was also, it's called multispectral imaging. So this is when you expose the print to different lights, so to visible light, but also ultraviolet light and infrared light, which are invisible to the naked eye. And then you look whether the colorant on the print absorb or reflects this light, and it gives you clues as to the identity of the colorant. And on this print, which I had not expected, if you look at the sky, you see you can't see the clouds. But when we illuminated it with ultraviolet light, suddenly the clouds were visible. So we can infer from that there used to be clouds on the print, but the colorant has faded. And why has it faded? Well, it could have faded possibly in the Japanese homes in the 19th century. But also we have photographs of people in Europe, of collectors, such as Claude Monet, the artist, or Claude Debussy, the music composer, who have their Japanese print prominently displayed on a wall by windows. People didn't know at the time that colorants were fugitive, but by using scientific method, we can see if they'd been applied on the print or not. The easiest way to spot an early edition of the Great Wave is to look at the borders of the cartouche. If there are no breaks, then it is a first edition one, most likely. Unless it's been retouched, and then you'll probably need me to know if it's an early one or a late one. So this is a rather late print. This is from the Capucine Museum in Genova in Italy. They were very nice and sent me high resolution pictures of the Great Wave. And it's a late one because we can see breaks in the cartouche, break in the wave line. And what's really interesting is the boats. So you've got some yellow of the boats here. And if you compare to an early one, compared to this one, so in this one you've got all the boats have some yellow. They all have some yellow. And this one, this boat has no yellow. And also this area here has been left out. It should have been printed in yellow. It's not been, there's no yellow. So at some point, a new block was made for the yellow areas. The color wood blocks were made actually in a less durable wood. So sometimes they had to be replaced. But why was it replaced by such a poor version? Why didn't they bother making a yellow area for this one? This has never been published about, so I was quite happy to have found that. And still later on, this block was changed in the very, very late version. So this one, which is the latest edition of the Great Wave that I've come across. And again, this was not written about. So suddenly, instead of having only this area of the boat printed in yellow and another part printed in grey, a new wood block's been made to replace the grey and the yellow. And now it's printed in pink. I mean, this is a very strange color scheme. I had never seen a great wave like this before I embarked on this work. But people apparently still liking this design because it was sold and it survived until now. It's not only the yellow woodblock that was recarved, it's the light blue one. And this is easy to spot. Once you know what you're looking at, the light blue woodblock at some point got lost, or they decided it was too damaged to be used, and they recut. Someone recut it. And again, I don't know why, but the shape of this new woodblock was completely different from the original one. And nobody understands why this is the case. Why didn't they try to make something quite faithful to the original design? We have a theory. The publisher of the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, Nishimura, had a very high reputation regarding the quality of the print. So it doesn't really make sense that he would ask someone to quickly make new blocks, like for the light blue and the yellow one, blocks that didn't really follow the design accurately, especially the yellow one where you've got one boat that's not printed at all in yellow. There are some letters from Nishimura who reports that he was having some financial difficulties. So is it possible that he sold these blocks and maybe one got lost in transport, or it was so damaged that somebody decided to recarve one, and maybe someone else, a different publisher, was responsible for the late editions of the Great Wave. We don't know, and until we find any historical records, we can't know more about it. So what does all this new information tell us now? Well, after revisiting Roger Key's research, I came to the conclusion that there are not 21 states of woodblock wear, but just 8. And with this information, now if you take a print of the Great Wave, you can sequence it very logically, very accurately. You can know if it's an early print or a late print. All this means that we're more certain than ever that the sea impression of the Great Waves that we have in our collection at the British Museum were made from the same keyblock, the keyblock that was carved using Hokusai's drawing. And this also means that Tim Clark has had much nicer Friday evenings. This is an area in the museum where we've done us scientists, we've done very little research on Japanese prints, so that was just a door opening. So no, for me it was just very all exciting stuff that nobody had done in depth before. I'm never bored of looking at the wave. I love the design. I love how Hokusai has represented the sea. I love the fact that, us as European, we see it one way, but Japanese people who are used to read from right to left, they see it completely differently. And it does look a bit different. It does look a bit more threatening and dangerous. What's next now? What I'm really interested in is to try to find out what the print looked like when it was pristine, when it had not been faded at all by light. All the scientific analysis we do on objects, they have to be non-destructive, so we can't come with a pair of scissors and cut a little edge and analyze this. So we have to be quite resourceful. So what we think we're allowed with is to take just a fiber. So we want to identify a colorant just by analyzing a tiny, tiny quantity of it. This is micro-destructive, so it's a very small element, very small amount of material, and it could tell us a lot about it.